Uinta Basin Arts and Special Events coverage on VTV Channel 6 and Strata WebView, made possible by
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Uinta County Library's Emergency Preparedness class. My name is Brent Gilley, Yankee prepper. Sends his apologies. He wasn't able to be here tonight, so he asked me to get things going. Tonight's class is sponsored by Basin Home Survival, located inside Basin Cleaning Systems, downtown Vernal, Utah. Do have hopes to keep this ongoing workshops. We can work together to help be prepared for whatever disaster comes our way. Let's get to tonight's main topic. It's on self-reliant. It's taught by Tal Ehlers. Tal is an emergency preparedness specialist. He is a public speaker and national trainer. Through his consulting firm, Tal speaks across the country to law enforcement, military, fire, and EMS organizations regarding personal emergency preparedness. He also trains families and individuals, and we are very privileged to have Tal as our very own Uinta County Emergency Preparedness Manager. So I'll turn the time over to the professional. Tal?
Thank you very much. No need for applause, just throw money. That's okay. Ed, can you hear me okay with the mic here, or do I need to move the mic up? You can hear me okay? All right, my name is Tal Ehlers. Wow, okay. I'm going to move it down. Anyway, I am the emergency manager for Uinta County, and Brent came to me and invited me to come and speak and present at this particular function. And I know that when I come and speak at a function like this, that I'm preaching to the choir, certainly. And what we're going to talk about tonight, it is certainly in the preparedness vein. I'm not going to talk about preparedness per se. I'm not going to talk about how to store food and water and sanitation. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I feel, is very significant. Should I not walk around? Getting feedback? Should I stay in one place? Would that help? Is that better? All right. But I want to talk to you about being self-sufficient again, and I feel that this is something that we have really gotten away from as a society. And so as I go through this, just sit back and relax. We're going to spend the next hour reminiscing and walking a little bit down memory lane, but I want to talk to you about some common principles that we have strayed from as a society and see if this can help you in your emergency preparedness plans. Now, that's a little bit about me. Those are some of the certifications that I have. I'm a firefighter, EMT. I've got a certificate as a master exercise practitioner from the Emergency Management Institute. I'm a special function officer with the Uinta County Sheriff's Office, and as you can tell, I really enjoy doing this sort of thing. I enjoy emergency response. I think disasters are cool. I think sometimes they're a little bit fun, as long as they're not happening to me, right? I just like to respond to them and help other people. But when you go through one yourself, it's an entirely different story. Also, as far as the safety and security in this building, we have exits, one out this door, and we go straight out through the glass the way we came in. Also on the left side here, if we don't trip over the cords, there is an exit right here, and we would go through those curtains to be able to do that. And then also bathrooms are right around the corner. The men's and the women's bathrooms are right there. And if you would please put your cell phones on stun or on vibrate, that would be greatly appreciated so that we don't have those distractions. As we talk about being self-sufficient, we have to look back at our ancestors. We have to go ahead and look at those people that came before us. And it's interesting to me because today in our society, in our culture, particularly here in the United States, it seems that we kind of push aside our elders. We push aside their information and their knowledge, and we push aside the life that they came through. And I'm at a point in my life where I'm able to look back at my parents and my grandparents' generations, and I feel that there's a lot of education there. I feel there is a lot of value there that we are missing out on as a society. And so as we look at some different cultures, and I'll bring one up for example, I'll bring up the Chinese culture. In the Chinese culture, you're probably familiar with this, the oldest person in a family or an organization has the most respect, honor, and dignity. And in the Chinese business world, the junior members of an organization will not make a decision without the consent of the senior member. When you arrive at a meeting or a banquet, you should always remember to greet the member with the highest seniority ranking at that occasion first, and whatever you do, you should never interrupt the senior member's speech. Do we see that in our society? Or do we say, you know what, the old codger doesn't know what he's talking about? And we seem to push these people aside. The fact that they have been through the life that they have traveled, the journey that they have made, and we push that aside, I think we're missing out on a lot. I think that with the technology that we have today, and we're going to talk a little bit about technology, I think we are losing sight of how we got here, and we are taking things for granted. As we look at some of the people that came before us, people that may have even lived 200 years ago, I think there is wisdom from these days, and I'm going to throw a couple things out here. This is not going to be a political speech, but I want you to look at what some of our relatives, some of those that have gone before us have said about society, and see if they are pertinent to our generation today. Here we have John Adams, the second president of the United States. He made a comment. He says, "Yesterday the greatest question was decided which ever was debated in America, and a greater perhaps never was nor will be decided among men. A resolution was passed without one dissenting colony that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." That's important right now as we're coming upon a presidential election, that we are the United States of America. It's a blessed nation, and we are fortunate to be living within her borders. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, made this comment. He said, "I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale." What do you think about that one? Do you think yeah, absolutely. Do you think Thomas Jefferson knew what he was talking about when he gave us that little tidbit of information? And here's another one. And this one I cherish. I think this one is really good. How many of us miss Ronald? I miss Ronald. Those were good days. All right. Now, variations of this are credited to Benjamin Franklin and also Alexander Tytler, and Ronald Reagan was known to have used this in his speeches, but he made this comment. He says, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse out of the public treasury." I bring these up because these are situations that we look at today, and even though these people lived 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 200 years ago, the wisdom that we have gained from their experience comes through even today in our society, where we can look at a quote like this and say, you know what, this individual knew exactly what they were talking about. So I have chose to demonstrate that while generations come and go, the wisdom that is developed from life's experience, both good and bad, should not be discarded with yesterday's trash. I feel very strongly that our human race is losing its edge or even our survival instincts because our ability to get by from day to day has become too convenient. It's as if we are so eager to look towards the future that we have absolutely forgotten how in the world we got here. So to this end, I want to share with you some wisdom from days that have gone by. And like I said, we're going to spend the next 45, 50 minutes reflecting upon how we got here, information that we have learned, and I'm sure you'll see quite readily how this ties into emergency preparedness. Now, I am currently taking some classes through a Utah university here in the state to earn a degree in emergency management. Emergency management was not a big field up until about 10 years ago. After 9/11, it became a very, very big field. And so a number of universities around the country decided that they should create a degree and offer a degree in this particular field. And it's been a very interesting journey. The funny thing is you have old timers like me. I'm in my mid-40s. I'm 45 years old. And I'm taking these classes and I'm looking back at my experiences over the last 25 to 40 years of my life. And I'm in a class with kids that are 22 years old. And it's interesting because I'm sure they look at me, I'm sure they look at my discussion posts online and they think, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's so far out of it. And I'm looking at their posts on the discussion sites and I'm thinking, yeah, you just wait. Your time is coming. And so I'm old enough. Billy Joel wrote a song back in the 80s. He said, I'm old enough to still see the passionate boy that I used to be, but I'm old enough to feel I've got a good look at the other side. And that's where I am right now, 45 years of age. I've got a little bit of snow on top and a little bit of a spread in the middle. And I feel like I'm sitting here going, wow, you know, in 45 years, you can really learn a lot. The reason that I bring this up is because a week and a half ago, we had a discussion for this school and we talked about this specific question. And those of you that are my age and a little bit older, you'll remember the words civil defense. Today, we recognize the words homeland security. The question was the approach for civil defense similar and or different to the approach for homeland security? every single post that was going on to this discussion blog, everybody was saying, yeah, they're the same, yeah, they're the same, yeah, they're the same. And I wrote something a little different, and if you don't mind, I'd like to share it with you. I saw what everybody had written, and I put this post on there. I said, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that the approach for Homeland Security is vastly different than back in the days of civil defense. And I want you to listen for this quote, because I'm going to say this again in a couple of minutes. This country's government used to want her citizens to take more ownership for their own well-being. Okay? So, for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that the approach for Homeland Security is vastly different than back in the days of civil defense. The Cold War was a very different time. The emergency preparation instructions for the civilian populations were completely different 40 to 70 years ago than they are today. The days of civil defense stressed survival. My parents, now in their 80s, talk of blackout curtains and rationing, curfews and a 2-year supply of food, water and, where possible, fuel. Food, water, and where possible, fuel. Civil defense was about surviving against the A-bomb and preserving our freedoms. It was also about pushing buttons. Who was going to push their red button first? A phone line, a direct phone line, was even installed between the White House and the Kremlin. It was not uncommon in the latter part of the 20th century for people to have a personal bomb shelter. My father was an architect and a general contractor, and at the University of Washington back in the 50s, he learned all about how to build bomb shelters because every school, every library, every government building and hospital was required to have a bomb shelter. In fact, this one was fun, the international multi-billion-dollar Amway Corporation sold soap products and bomb shelters back in the 60s. How many of you remember that? I just showed my age right there, because if you had a bomb shelter, of course you would need a year's supply of soap and laundry detergent, okay? So, up until the 1980s, emergency plans for several counties along the Wasatch Front instructed civilian populations to leave the area in the event of a nuclear attack. Outlying counties should prepare their communities to receive thousands upon thousands of refugees from the Wasatch Front in the event of a forced evacuation due to a nuclear attack. Those plans no longer exist. And I want to reiterate, those plans no longer exist. Those plans are gone. Even the Soviet Union had a huge civil defense plan. If you look at the pictures of large Russian cities from the 50s and 60s, you will notice large concrete buildings, wide streets, and a lot of concrete walkways. Very little green vegetation was incorporated into the community plans because trees, grass, and dirt act like a sponge for fallout. They wanted to make their communities as safe as possible in the event of an attack. The Russians also wanted to survive. Well-known speaker and author Dr. Igor Shafid, a former Soviet military officer and physician, has spoken at many conferences regarding the civil defense strategies of yesteryear. He still speaks of training civilians and military personnel with this style of instruction. Quote, anyone taking shelter in a bunker or basement after a nuclear blast where the level of radiation exceeds 8 to 80 rad hours cannot remain there longer than 24 hours. If the level of radiation is beyond that, they could remain there up to 3 days. Nobody talks like that anymore. We don't hear about that stuff now. When was the last time you heard an emergency alarm about how to prepare for a nuclear disaster? It's been years. It's been longer than that. I realized that with 9/11, we learned a lot about dirty bombs. We learned a lot about terrorism. There was the threat of a possible nuclear bomb, a suitcase device, but we really haven't heard about that for what, 5, 8 years? Feel free to disagree with me. It's been quite a while. Very few people teach this kind of knowledge to the citizenry anymore. We all teach of having a 72-hour kit ready and waiting for each family member. We talk about drop cover and hold on and secure your water heater to the wall in the event of an earthquake. We teach people to have a 3-day supply of food and water and an evacuation plan. The Homeland Security instruction of today is not about survival. It is about making it through a disaster with as much comfort as possible until a sense of normalcy returns. There is very little in our state, county, and city emergency operations plans about nuclear threats, not because it isn't possible, but because it is improbable based on other threats that are more likely to be carried out by our nation's enemies. Today, too many civilians believe that another attack like the magnitude of 9/11 on U.S. soil is unlikely. They say, it won't happen to me, or it won't happen here. They have a very short memory. They believe that if something does happen, that the local authorities and FEMA are going to rush in with bottled water and debit cards to take care of their ills, and this, in my opinion, is blissful ignorance. Sure, we push Citizen Corps programs like the Community Emergency Response Team and the Medical Reserve Corps, and it makes us all feel warm and fuzzy. This year, FEMA wanted to cut the 2013 grants for the Citizen Corps programs, and 11 states told the federal government that without the funding, they would eliminate their Citizen Corps programs at the state level and local jurisdictions could fend for themselves. What kind of commitment to the preparedness programs by the state departments of emergency management does that reflect? People don't feel the personal ownership in this country's protection and self-defense like they did in the civil defense years. That is reflected in our government's plans. This country's government used to want her citizens to take more ownership for their own well-being. The strategy changes between civil defense and homeland security very greatly in what the government now expects of their citizens and what the citizens expect of their government. Citizens are caught up in the glee of feeling like Uncle Sam has their back. The federal government has perpetuated the idea that they can throw money at every little rainstorm and that they can make all the badness go away. I believe this is an unhealthy and dangerous perspective for both parties to subscribe. Governments need to plan to prepare their citizens, and the citizenry needs to prepare to be self-sustaining for a minimum of 30 days following a disaster, regardless of what kind of disaster they may experience. If you talked about a bomb shelter and a 2-year supply of food in today's culture, people would call you a doomsayer and a nut job. And that was my post. So the fact is, I'm looking backwards. I remember the Cold War. I remember being 17 years of age, sitting in a college prep class at a high school in Salt Lake City, and the Russians had shot down a Japanese airliner. And I remember sitting in that class being sick to my stomach thinking, that's it. That's the straw that's going to break the camel's back. I'm 17, I'm almost 18, I'm going to go to battle with Russia. How many of you remember those sentiments? Just waiting for the other shoe to drop, just wondering when something was going to happen. Unfortunately, since 1989, that has not been the fear that we had. I think that there is value in looking backwards for advice and information on how to move forward. Winston Churchill, wise man that he was, said this: those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So for the next few minutes, I'd like to take you down a walk down memory lane. And because these are my memories, I have to ask you to walk on my path. However, I would bet that some of the ideas and images provided in this address will cause several of you to reminisce of simpler times. Others in the room may not relate whatsoever to the history of which I will refer, but I hope to help everyone consider why the wisdom from prior generations is so essential when discussing the importance of self-sufficiency and personal emergency preparedness. How do you like that? 80 pounds ago, that was me. That picture was taken back in about 1986. I made those pants, by the way. Still very proud of that accomplishment. I used to have people stop me in the mall and say, where did you get those? And if I had been smart back then, I would have mass-produced them and sold them. They looked really cool. The bad thing was within 6 months, I had used so much bleach on them that they just started to eat a hole in them and they practically fell apart on their own. But for 6 months, I looked like that. Anyway, but that was quite a while ago. I was born in the 60s, and I frequently tell my children that I am a child of the 80s. I am young enough to be part of Generation X, but old enough to have witnessed an incredible shift in tradition and technology in these United States. I am old enough to remember when men wore fedora hats and a trench coat when they went out of the home, and I'm old enough to remember when women wore dresses when camping. At times, I will still refer to a microwave oven as a radar range or a music CD as an album. I'm old enough to vividly remember black and white televisions. I can remember the song playing on the radio, Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. I can remember Corvette Stingrays. And call me old-fashioned, I believe that when you're applying for a job, man or a woman, you should dress up. I believe a man should wear a tie. I believe a woman should wear a dress. I don't care if you're applying for a job with an accounting firm, and I don't care if you're applying for a job at McDonald's. Have a little class. And could somebody please tell me at what point wearing your pants down below your butt became a fashion statement and not something that was completely ludicrous and laughable? See, my age is showing through already, isn't it? All right. Now, in addition to remembering the way things were 30, 40 years ago, I have a laptop computer as well as a desktop computer. I carry 2 cell phones with me at all times. I have an iPod. I have a GPS in a couple of my vehicles. I think technology is a wonderful thing. With one of my cell phones, it's a smartphone. I can check my email. I can send messages. I can check the news. I can check the weather from virtually anywhere in the world. My age is relevant to the topic because I fear that the early babies of my generation, take note of my age, I feel the babies of my generation are the last link between the common sense philosophies that allowed us to provide for our own dinner table and the technology that has given us vast information at our fingertips. In 2 seconds, we can learn everything we could ever hope to know about the conflict between Israel and Iran. We can learn everything about the failed IPO from Facebook. We can learn everything we ever wanted to know about an old actor like Donald O'Connor or Rock Hudson. We can look that stuff up and know about it instantly. The problem is now in this country we have over 47 million people on food stamps. We have 47 million people out there that probably couldn't plant a potato if their life depended on it. And the unfortunate thing is that eventually it just might. All right? Now, right here, we have some folks from the Greatest Generation. And in my lifetime, I've had the opportunity and privilege of knowing a lot of people from the Greatest Generation. The Greatest Generation is a term coined by journalist Tom Brokaw to describe the generation who grew up in the United States during World War I. They grew up during the deprivation of the Depression, and they also fought World War II. This generation, it's agreed, was generally born between about 1901 and 1924. Tom Brokaw wrote in his 1998 book, The Greatest Generation, stating that he believed that it was the greatest generation that any society had ever produced. He contended that these men and women fought not for fame and recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. When they came back, they rebuilt America into a superpower. Can you imagine sending a generation, this is going to sound really sarcastic, and some of you may be mad at me for saying this, but can you imagine sending a generation to war today of what we have in this country? Can you imagine sending out a group of 25-year-olds that live in their mama's basement playing video games and smoking pot? It scares me. It genuinely scares me. Because here we had men and women that were willing to do that which is right. And we saw the same thing during World War II in Korea. The next generation was known as the silent generation. It's agreed that this generation was basically born between 1925 and 1945. These folks are largely those that fought during the Korean War. These generations of Americans experienced a very different world than the one we lived in today. They survived Korea, they survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, they survived the riots of the 60s, they survived Vietnam and the threat of communism. Not to mention the recession of the late 70s and early 80s. Moments in history that most of us only learned about in a high school history class, they had survived. And according to their histories, self-sufficiency consisted of setting aside seed wheat from this year's harvest for next year's planting. A smokehouse was a matter of need and preservation. Collecting and storing wood for the fire was an ongoing chore. Grains and supplies were purchased in bulk because trips to the trading post or country store were infrequent. Furs and pelts were carefully preserved because they would eventually be used for clothing or for bedding. Now you can see where self-sufficiency and personal preparedness are coming into play. We cannot allow ourselves to lose the simple day-to-day knowledge these generations had. They did not just survive, they lived well and they thrived, and they knew how to get by when resources were limited. They knew how to get by when the conveniences were slim, and they knew how to get by when the wolves were literally at the door. Now what many may consider to be survivalism by today's standards was largely common sense just 50 years ago. People thought ahead for their most basic needs. A barrel placed under the rain gutter would catch falling water on a stormy day. A root cellar would preserve the summer's harvest for months. An ice house would keep food items cold through the summer. A wood pile or a load of coal would assure that a home would be kept warm for months and that a flame would continuously burn in the oven. More often than not, a loaded shotgun would hang over the fireplace. A well-placed shot would provide meat for the table during lean times, and when needed, it could also discourage an unwanted intruder in the yard, be it man or beast. In today's uncertain time, our government has told us to have a 72-hour kit and a 3-day supply of food and water. Has Western civilization become so dependent on modern-day conveniences that we have lost the knowledge of some of man's most basic survival principles? Should we encounter war, terrorist attacks, a nuclear disaster, or even a basic natural disaster, have we as an intelligent society slid so far off of center that we would have to depend on the Department of Homeland Security for guidance? At what point did people stop preparing for the possible and the probable? My mother, right there in the middle, the little girl, that picture's taken in Blanding, Utah, that picture's probably from about 1938. She was born in 1933. She's told me stories of my grandfather's massive garden and orchard. She remembers how he would regularly harvest vegetables for their dinner table. She told me that my grandfather hunted year-round to put food on the table. From what I understand, the game warden just turned a blind eye because he knew that my grandfather was just putting food on the table. My mother knew how to bottle fruit, butcher meat, make butter, make homemade root beer in the ice house with yeast, sew, knit, and shoot rabbits for the dinner table. Now this was their spread. I don't know how much that home would go for today. $2,000-3,000 maybe, right? Not a big house. Had about 3 or 4 rooms in it. I want you to notice there's 2 chimneys on that house. The huge garden they have in the front. The orchard over to this side that you can't see. And that's my grandmother and grandfather. And I show that picture because I remember this home. I remember the orchard. I remember eating the fresh pea pods out in the garden. And this is how I grew up. How many of us have wonderful memories like that? How many of us know people today that don't know what they're going to have for dinner until they go by the grocery store on the way home? Okay? So, there's the slide. There on the left, they've got a coal pile, they've got a wood pile, they have everything they need to get by. That picture was probably taken in about the 60s. Now, my father was born in 1928. He knew how to hunt and garden. His childhood property was alive with peach, plum, pear, cherry, and nut trees. He enjoyed some of the lesser-known fruits and vegetables like rhubarb, asparagus, gooseberries, red currants, grapes, and Jerusalem artichokes. He oftentimes spoke of raising chickens and rabbits as a child to make extra money. I'm told that many of these critters also ended up on the kitchen table. I specifically asked my parents when they felt that people began to depart from the paths of self-sufficiency and depend more on technology and convenience. It is generally felt that the late 50s to early 70s really marked the decline of self-sufficiency in favor of modern convenience. It would appear that technology and convenience have dragged us away from old-fashioned common sense and good judgment. I'll give an example. I had a conversation with a friend of mine in Tucson about 10 years ago. And we were talking about food storage and we were talking about general preparedness. And he thought that it was silly to spend money on a perishable item, particularly somebody that would want to buy 2 or 3 months or even more food than that, a year's supply of food or something like that. He thought that was absolutely crazy. He said, Tal, in a disaster, there is a Costco, there is a Walmart, and there is an Albertsons within a mile of my home. And I know that I know that I can go to those stores, that their accountants, their purchasing agents, their bean counters are going to be so greedy that they're going to make sure that their store shelves never run out, that they're going to have exactly what I need in the event of a disaster. And I tried to explain to him scenario after scenario where towns had been hit by disaster and the grocery stores were literally wiped out. When I lived in Arizona, I knew a gentleman there, a very successful businessman by the name of Gordon Ray, and he owned a chain of grocery stores, Ray's Ranch Market. He also owned a chain of mini markets, and he sold out several years ago and retired and has done very, very well for himself. And I had a conversation with Gordon. I said, Gordon, how long does it take for your grocery shelves to clear? And he said, I'll give you actual experiences, Bay of Pigs, Y2K, and 9/11. He says the mini markets empty in a couple hours. The grocery stores, they empty in about 12. That's how long it lasts. So my friend felt confident that these businesses, being driven by money and greed, would never let that happen, that they would never let their store shelves run empty, and yet we see it happen time and time again. Now, this is my quote, this is my claim to fame. Those who fail to learn wisdom from their elders are in big trouble if the store is closed. Think I can get that published? Okay? And it's a true fact. People just don't think about this stuff. In disaster after disaster, we witness communities that are literally wiped out of their existing store shelf supplies. Regular routes of distribution are interrupted and people are forced to do without. And I call this false sense of security the mini market myth. Do you want a candy bar or a soda? How about some gasoline or a gallon of milk? Hey, it's just around the corner. Now you can even do some of your shopping for your upcoming holidays at your local convenience store. The mini market myth has left us all feeling that small necessities are only a moment away and that they always have a stock of whatever could possibly be needed. The best part is if you accidentally drive by one location on your way home from work, don't worry, there's another one on the next block. But what would happen if several hundred people converged on a convenience store at one time? How much inventory do they really carry? The fact is that convenience stores only carry a 1 to 3 week supply of perishable inventory because it is perishable. And there you have the mini market myth. One thing that market analysis, demographics, and population estimates don't count on, Everybody wanting and needing the exact same items at the exact same time. It's like trying to buy whipping cream the night before Thanksgiving morning. Are you kidding? You can't find that anywhere. You can go all over Vernal, you won't find it. You know how I know that? Last year my wife sent me on a mission. You should have seen me at the Walmart with my arm in the refrigeration case, clear up at the very top, and I was able to find the last 2 little cartons, pints of whipping cream. I was a hero that night, by the way. What would we do without debit cards, checking accounts, and credit cards? Ever gone to a bank and found that their ATM was down? How about buying gas at the station and the power is out so their pumps are down? Ever consider the importance of having cash on hand? How many of you remember about 3-4 months ago there was a tractor trailer that took out the power pole down by the Maverick in Naples? Maverick closed their doors, 7-Eleven shut their doors. I think Maverick had somebody in front saying, if you don't have cash, don't bother coming in. Because without the power, their credit card machines, their ATMs, everything didn't work. Some may question my faith in technological advancements. You may think from my tone that I would send us back to the early 1900s, that we forsake our cell phones and iPads and that we go back to using an open flame for heat. And on the contrary, I am a huge proponent of technological advances. I think medical and technological advances are a wonderful thing. That is my 12-year-old son. I should say that's my 21-year-old son when he was 12. That is what happened after an ATV accident. My son ended up at Primary Children's Hospital for 3 weeks. He was in a coma for 11 days, and after that, he was in recovery and rehab for 10 days, and we were able to bring him home 3 weeks after the accident. The thing that I still remember about that experience, and you can see how many machines he was hooked up to, and this is back in 2004, I remember when he was walking out of the hospital, there was a nurse that had been with him the very, very first night. And when she saw him walking out of the hospital, she began to cry. And my wife spoke with her and she said, if your son had passed away in the first 36 hours, nobody on the intensive care unit floor would have given it a second thought. And to see him walk out of the hospital 3 weeks later was nothing short of a miracle. Thank God for our medical advances and our technological advances, and for the skilled people that exercise those in our society. This is another son of mine. He's 9 years old, but when he was 3, he was diagnosed with leukemia. You can't tell me that technology hasn't touched my life. I'm not saying that we shouldn't use it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be grateful for it, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't apply it. I am saying that it is important that we don't forget where we came from. These generations that have gone before us are dying. They're leaving us. And their knowledge and their wisdom is going with us. And a little bit later, I'll read some entries from my mother's blog where she talked about some of the things that she used to do as a small child. I believe that these two can function together and that we don't have to lose this knowledge that we spent so many generations obtaining to move on. Technology is only as good as the infrastructure that supports it. I know everybody's excited about Facebook and Twitter, and they've got their cell phones and this new phone and that new phone, and I also know that a power outage is a sympathetic condition of nearly every disaster. So how good is the cell phone going to be? How good is Facebook going to be? As long as your battery's backed up or until you can get power. You know, the power outage we had last week, I guess it was a turkey vulture or the Kentucky Fried Chicken turkey vulture after it hit the power, the substation and set it off. You know, people start to freak out after about 10 minutes of not having power. I like an occasional power outage. I think a power outage lets me find out how good I think I really am. And it teaches me things. What don't I know? What if, now picture this, we were without power a few hours last week. What if we were pushed back 100 years due to a disaster? Are we losing our ability as a society to get by without turning something on, powering up, or recharging our battery? And how many people could cook over an open flame if it came to that? How many people today still know how to cook unless it comes out of a can, a bag, or a box? There are those that I've spoken with over the years that believe that any type of personal preparedness or self-sufficiency is mere paranoia, and to believe that one should set aside something extra for a rainy day is to merely cast a negative aura into their future. Do you believe the world will end, they will ask me, or is the government going somewhere? Now I want you to get a load of these numbers. This last year, 2011, the United States saw an incredible upsurge in disastrous events. not just in the United States, but all around the globe. But here in the United States specifically, we saw more disasters in 2011 than we saw in all of the 1980s combined. We saw 11 major disasters that were over $1 billion. Okay, last year, in 2011, there were the total destruction and damage, there were over 1,000 lives lost, over $52 billion in damages across the United States. And that's more than all the 80s combined after adjusting for inflation. That's a lot of destruction and damage. Half of the billion-dollar disasters were tornado outbreaks in one of the deadliest years on record. More than 540 people were killed just in those 6 tornadoes. And in 4 days in April 2011, there were 343 tornadoes in the largest tornado outbreak on record. 199 tornadoes in 1 day. And I'm telling you right now, I don't even know how to respond to that. As the emergency manager, I don't even know where to start. I mean, that's when I get on the phone with Duchesne County and Daggett County and the Division of Emergency Management with the state of Utah, and I say, start sending me resources, and I start lining out for them exactly what I need them to send out our way. Can you imagine 199 tornadoes in 1 day? All right, then we look at other things around the world. Look at the earthquake in Concepcion, Chile last year. It was an 8.9. It literally picked up the city of Concepcion and moved it 10 feet to the west. Look at the devastation from the earthquake and tsunami in Sendai, Japan. Those poor people over there. Here they had a 9.0 earthquake, followed up with a tsunami, followed up with a nuclear meltdown, and then the next day it snowed. All right? These people, they got a quadruple whammy there. That's a really bad day. Think back about 20 years. Did we ever hear about a 9.0 earthquake? Oh, maybe back in the 60s up in Alaska. And yet today, all the time, Indian Ocean, December 2004, 9.0. Concepcion, Chile, 8.9. Sendai, Japan, 9.0. Earthquakes that are so large that it's literally tilting the earth, even though it's ever so slightly, it's literally tilting the earth on its axis. That's how big these earthquakes are. And then there's other things that could knock us back 100 years. This one, and ma'am, I don't know your name, but you're really going to like that. Okay? September 1st and 2nd, 1859, we had the Carrington event. And what happened here was an electromagnetic pulse that was so big off of the surface of the sun. It was a coronal mass ejection so big that it fried the telegraph systems all across North America and Europe. It was so bad that it set telegraph offices on fire and electrocuted the telegraph operators. That's how big this solar flare was. And for a long time, people didn't talk much about solar flares. That was kind of like zombies and aliens. You know, we don't talk about solar flares very much. And yet we have seen some very big activity off of the sun just in the last year or so. Now, in 1921 and 1960, there were less severe storms, solar storms, but nevertheless, these solar storms did exist. And this year, January 19th, 2012, there was a very powerful flare that erupted off of the surface of the sun. Right now, we're in an 11-year cycle, and we're watching for heavy solar activity in May of 2013. Is there something out there beyond us that could knock us back 100 years? You bet there is. If it happened in 1859, it can happen again. And if it did happen again, it would put us back to about 1910. No iPods, no Facebooks. Most of the cars wouldn't even work. That's an amazing thought. But I don't think that is an impossible event. This was from an article that was written back March 6th about another solar flare, a couple of solar flares that erupted, and I'll let you go ahead and just read that. I don't need to look at that or read that for you. But as you read that, let me just carry on here. What is wrong with having some of life's necessities and luxuries on hand for an emergency? No one would question the need to purchase a flashlight and extra batteries before a blackout. So why would it be considered ludicrous to buy a flashlight before a blackout? Perhaps it is belief. I've experienced blackouts before, and I believe that it's very likely that I will experience more blackouts. I believe it will happen again. I carry a spare tire in my car. I didn't go out and buy the tire separately or purchase it as an add-on or an extra. The car salesman didn't go down a list and say, Mr. Ehlers, I think we could get the price down a hair if we leave out the spare tire. And you know, I would never say to him, you're right, get rid of that spare because I need to save that extra $200 on the car. Car manufacturers believe that their products are not perfect, and in the event that a tire fails due to internal or external forces, the car manufacturer does not want their customer to remain stranded. Therefore, they include a spare tire in the car. What does a spare do for me as a car owner? It gives me confidence. It gives me a feeling of security. It gives me options. I have the option to change a damaged tire with the spare. It gives me the option to complete my journey from point A to point B, and once I'm back on the road, the spare tire will have fulfilled its purpose and its reason for being. Ever wonder why they call it a spare? I may never need the spare tire. I may only see it once every few months when I check the air pressure or when I load groceries into the trunk, but the security that I feel when I'm driving down the road with the knowledge that I have a spare tire is worth the cost and the little bit of space that it takes up in the car. I believe in preparing for a flat tire before a flat tire happens. I wouldn't have waited for the flat tire to go out and get a spare, and I don't consider myself crazy for forecasting a possible flat tire. Do you see my analogy, or do I need to draw you a bigger picture with crayons? Does that make sense? And yet people will think you're nuts. People think you're out of your mind for being here tonight. And yet this is what people don't understand. 50 years ago, this was just common sense. Would you guys have actually paid me to come and speak to you 50 years ago about being personally prepared? I travel around the country now. People pay me money, they pay my airfare, they pay my hotel, to come to New Jersey, to come to Minnesota, to come to Arizona, to speak with them about emergency preparedness. And I absolutely know, 50 years ago, I wouldn't have had a job. Why? Because people kept a rain barrel under the rain gutter. They kept seedweed in the barn for next year's planting. They had a root cellar, they had a smokehouse, they had an ice house. Here we are 50 years later, and we have to tell people, hey, you might want to consider taking care of yourself for a little while. Now, what about a tornado? I want to tell you something, just a funny little story. My mother told me when I was a child, she said, Tal, we do not get tornadoes in Utah. That was my mindset. We don't get tornadoes in Utah. And yet there it was, August of 1999. I was back in, isn't it funny that we had a tornado in Salt Lake and I was back in Indiana? What's the irony there? But I'm in a hotel room, I was out there for business, and I'm sitting on the edge of my hotel bed and I'm watching the TV, I'm watching CNN, and I'm watching the tornado hit the Delta Center. And I watched the replay over and over. Can you imagine the paradigm shift with me? I'm sitting there going, but my mama said that we don't get no tornadoes in Salt Lake. And I'm watching this and I couldn't believe that it happened. Do I believe that tornadoes can hit Utah now? Yeah, tornadoes hit Utah every year. Just because we don't have them recorded on the news, it doesn't mean that they're not recorded by the Weather Service. They do happen, and we see these things happening frequently. How many of you have ever used one of those? Have you have one? Have you tried to buy one lately? They're expensive, and you have to order them online. I haven't seen anybody locally that sells them. But, you know, having a washboard, it's simple. Yes? Did they really? Can I ask how much you paid?
It was probably like 15 years ago. I'm thinking like right around 20.
Okay. I've looked at them online. They're like 40 bucks, 45 bucks.
Lehman's catalog carries.
Lehman's. Lehman's is wonderful. They are really wonderful. They have a lot of really good stuff there. Everything that doesn't need electricity. And it's still very functional and usable. All right. Now, having a vast knowledge of preparedness and self-sufficiency basics is insufficient if we do not have the tools to apply it. My father maintained items around the house and in the garage. He had army tents and sleeping bags that he had picked up cheap at the surplus stores. Backpacks, hatchets, and camping stoves were also on hand. He had several hunting rifles and a supply of ammunition to go with him. Deer hunting was considered a ritual in my home state, and it was an anticipated family get-together every fall. Even my mom carried her rifle up on the mountain. I remember the year that my mom got her buck and my dad didn't. That was not a good year at my house. Okay? As a boy, I believe that my dad's hunting and camping supplies merely supported his many outdoor hobbies, but I'm sure in the back of his mind he knew that these items would help sustain his family in the event of an emergency, be it a natural disaster or a catastrophe caused by man. Of course, at my young age, I didn't understand anything beyond the necessities of today, and that's where my generation and the generation of my parents differed. You see, at the age of 10, I had never known hunger. I had never truly understood sacrifice, and my needs of food, water, and shelter were met on a daily basis. My parents, on the other hand, had experienced a very different time in history. As I mentioned previously, many of our parents and grandparents lived through very tough times in our world's history. My parents, I'm sure due to their upbringing and some habits to be sure, visibly followed the preparedness principles handed down to them by their parents and grandparents. We had a storage room in the basement that was used specifically for the storing of food. Wheat was stored in bulk for grinding into flour. A hand-crank wheat grinder stood at the ready. Jars of bottled cherries and peaches lined the shelves. Cans of beans and other assorted legumes shared their corner of the room. There was also a can of dried this and vacuum. There were also cans of dried this and vacuum packed that. The neat thing about our storage room, like I said before, is that it was a bomb shelter. Outside in our yard, we had a variety of fruit trees, nut trees, and raspberry. Oh, and a raspberry patch large enough for our family and several of our neighbors to satisfy their raspberry cravings for the year. My family grew a productive garden each year. The summers were filled with fresh tomatoes, asparagus, and zucchini squash. We had a root cellar full of Jerusalem artichokes, carrots, and potatoes. And my mother, while time did not always allow her to do it as much as she would have liked, she knew how to bottle fruit, and she had the necessary equipment to do so. In the youth of my 20s, I never truly considered my family's immediate personal security. However, as time progressed, my wife and I became aware of the need to become more personally prepared. To give you an idea of how much our perspectives have changed, and this is significant, this is a personal story to poke a little bit of fun at myself. I want to tell you a story about a storm, a thunderstorm, a monsoon storm that came through Arizona in the summer of 2000. My wife and I lived in Tucson, Arizona for about 14 years. One day we had this amazing monsoon and it was really beautiful, and of course the power went out, and I was sitting in my home and I sat there and I thought, what do I need? What don't I have? If there was, if this was really a big disaster, is there anything that I don't have? And I just sat down to think. I thought, there's propane in the propane tank on the barbecuer, and I've got flashlights, and we've got water, everything's okay. My neighbor across the street, on the other hand, really nice lady, she comes over to talk to me, and it's just this lady. She's a single parent with her 16-year-old son, and she comes over to me and she says, "Tal, I don't have any water." And I said, "Well, that's because the power's out, and we're on wells out here, and they're electric pumps, and if the power goes out, we lose the pumps and we lose the water." And she says, "Well, I just don't know what I'm going to do." And I said, "Do you have water?" And she says, "Well, I think I've got a half a gallon in the fridge." I said, "Okay." 6 hours later, power's still not on. Marjorie's now in a full-fledged panic. And I had gone into town, and I called her on the phone, and I said, is the power on yet? She says, "No." And I said, "Is there anything I can get for you?" She says, "Could you please bring me a gallon of water?" I was impatient and young and a little bit arrogant. And I turned to my wife in the car and I said, "For Pete's sake, we live in the middle of a desert. We live in the middle of nowhere. And this woman hasn't even thought to have some water stored up at her house. We lived 20 miles from the closest Walmart. And yet she hadn't even made the most simple preparations." And my wife, in all of her wisdom, and as smart as she is, she turned to me and she says, "It wasn't so long ago that we didn't have a gallon of water either." And she was right. She was absolutely right. So it is not for us to criticize those that haven't caught the vision yet. It took me a while. Even though I was raised around it, it still took me a while to catch that vision for myself. We can set an example. We can help them. We can love them into it. We can share with them. We can show them how it's done. We can invite them over. But just because somebody doesn't catch the vision, it doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means that they haven't been touched yet. Now, there are people that are never going to catch the vision, and I hate to say that those people, in the event of an actual disaster, are going to suffer. The government's not going to be there to help them in time. Their faith-based organization isn't going to be there to help them in time. There will be people that will suffer. Imagine if you called 911 and no one answered. That happens, and it's happened during countless disasters around the United States. Hurricane Katrina, Joplin, Missouri, it does happen. We want people to be self-sustaining for as long as possible. Now, recently, and we're about done. I'm going to be here for about another 12, 14 minutes. We're going to finish up. But to end, kind of the grand finale, if you'll humor me for about the next 6 or 7 minutes, I'd like to read some information to you that I think you'll find interesting. Recently, I had a conversation with my 79-year-old mother. And I said, how did you used to do it? What did you do in this situation, in that situation? And so she blogged about it, which I thought was funny because my 79-year-old mother has a blog, and she talked about how it was in the olden days. And she wrote down a number of things, and I want to read through this with you and just come on this little nostalgic journey with me for a minute, and let's learn a little bit from our elders. So this is my mother speaking. My dad, and by the way, she calls him Daddy from time to time, which is funny because she always referred to him as Daddy. She says, my dad always started early in the year to ensure his family would have enough food during the coming winter. In February, he pruned his fruit trees. He had a lot of apple trees, some pears, peaches, prunes, and apricots. Spraying would come later. We had grapevines, black currants, rhubarb, multiplier onions, Jerusalem artichokes, curly leaf parsley, which we began to eat with our bread and milk as soon as it was big enough to pick. And we had strawberries and that also came back in the spring. In early March, as soon as the ground began to thaw, he plowed several plots of ground so he could plant an enormous garden. Of course, in those days, we couldn't go to the store and buy fresh vegetables year-round, so he was anxious to get seeds into the ground so we could have fresh food as early as possible. He always planted peas in March, and as soon as after the peas as he deemed it was wise to do so, he planted onions, radishes, lettuce, carrots, and other seeds. He knew what to plant, and he knew when to plant it. My grandfather was never a wealthy man. He was a laborer his entire life. He was a skilled laborer. He was a brickmaker. I think he was the janitor for the high school for a long time. He was never a wealthy man. But my mother made the comment, she says, I never remembered going hungry as a child. She said we had bread and milk often. Sometimes it was bread and milk and radishes, and sometimes it was bread and milk and onions, and sometimes it was bread and milk and dandelion greens, anything to break up the monotony of the bread and the milk. But she says, I never remembered going hungry. That, my friends, is an accomplishment that any father would be proud of. She says, obviously, if we were going to eat onions all winter, obviously, if we were going to eat onions all winter and also be able to cook with onions, he had to plant a fairly sizable amount of onions. But we were always eager for spring and new green things that grew early. I remember my dad bringing in pigweeds for Mom to cook. We'd put a little salt and pepper and butter and a touch of vinegar on our pigweeds, and they were delicious. Also, he would bring in watercress from the ditch bank. Watercress is an early spring vegetable. Oh, how we love to eat fresh watercress and to eat it with our bread and milk. Daddy would also look for new tender dandelion greens, and we loved those as much as the pigweeds. We seasoned them just like we seasoned the pigweeds and thought that it was food fit for kings. Of course, it doesn't take radishes long to grow to an edible size. He planted both red and white radishes and green onions, and we loved all of them. The lettuce also got to an edible size very quickly. The peas began to bear in May. Oh, how I loved to go out in the pea patch and sit on the ground and shell out those wonderful little green balls that tasted so sweet and fresh off the vine. In the meantime, Daddy had planted potatoes, squash, cabbage, celery, turnips, parsnips, beets, Swiss chard, tomatoes, green beans, summer squash, and we had lots of cucumbers for eating with our bread and milk as well as other meals, and that he also grew so that we could have dill pickles. We had chickens, lambs, pigs, rabbits, and cows. We could always count on having milk, cream, butter, and cottage cheese. Our cows would have a calf every spring, and when it was a bull calf, we butchered it in the fall. We butchered a pig and a lamb as well. As you may have guessed, the garden, orchard, and meat items had to be taken care of to see us through the winter, so the next priority was to have a way to store and preserve them. Daddy was always up early and in the summer, and as soon as it was light, he was out in the garden checking the ripeness of the vegetables. If there were peas or string beans to be picked, he would call the kids out to help pick, and then we would bring chairs out of the house, put them in the shade on the west side of the house, and we would just shell our peas or snap the stem ends and pull the strings off the green beans to get them ready to be put into bottles. And then, then they would go into the pressure canner for winter use. When the corn was ready, Daddy always picked it. I don't think he trusted his kids' ability to determine whether or not it was the special ripeness for canning. But after he had picked the corn, we all gathered on the west side of the shade to husk the corn. Of course, all the kids pitched in with whatever ability level they had and helped Mom with the canning. Believe me, it was a group activity. Of course, the fruit ripened and it also had to be preserved. Daddy built cellars or pits to preserve the vegetables and the fruit that we didn't bottle. He always built separate cellars for fruits and vegetables. He would dig a hole in the ground probably about 3 feet deep, maybe 4 feet wide, and 8 or 10 feet long, and he would build a wood frame to keep it from collapsing. It would also hold the roof on the cellar. We can't do that anymore. We have homeowners associations. We have houses that are this far apart. We have built our society and our culture. We can't even take care of ourselves. We don't have the ability to do this. We live in a rural community. There are still a lot of people with farms. There may be people within your neighborhood or within your faith-based organization that may allow you to plant a garden on their property, offer to pay for the water, offer to do something for them. I'm renting a home right now over in a complex where I got neighbors so close that if I throw a rock, it'll go 10 feet and hit someone's house. And we spoke with the homeowners association and asked them if they would set aside some land so that we could do square foot gardening and build some planter boxes, and they said yes. And that's what we did this summer. We grew a garden. And even on our front porch, my wife bought some planter boxes, and she planted Swiss chard, and she planted tomatoes, and she planted things in those planter boxes on our front porch. Now, the home that I moved from before I came up here, I had 5 acres and wood-burning stoves, and it was a nice setup. I didn't think I'd ever leave that home, but I had the privilege of coming to Vernal, and so we came here, and we're making do until we can get another home and until we can have another garden. But it's important that even if we feel that we're in a circumstance where it's like, well, I can't dig a root cellar, I can't have chickens, I can't grow a garden, think of ways to be able to do this. Your friends, your family, your grandparents, do they have property where they would allow you to go ahead and still do things so that you yourself can be more self-sufficient and provide for your own needs? My mother goes on to say, I was the youngest of 7 children, and I was 14 when my parents got their first refrigerator. You may ask, how did you keep milk without a refrigerator? And that is a good question. Of course, the winter isn't a problem, but it is possible to have cool milk to drink even in the summer. The windowsills in the homes built back in the 20s and 30s were wider than the windowsills that we have in our homes now. We had a window on the north side of the house, and in the summer, my mother would open the north window a few inches and put cool water in a pan that was round and maybe 3 or 4 inches deep. Then she would put a pitcher with a cover full of milk into the pan with water. We always had flour sacks, and she would get the sack dripping wet in cool water and wrap the pitcher all the way to the top with the wet sack. The water would wick up through the sack, and the north breeze would keep the sack cool, and the cool wet sack kept the milk cool. We always checked the water level a couple of times a day to be sure that the milk would be cool. The window was large enough that we could have 2 pitchers cooling at one time. I should probably mention that they were large pitchers. The milk was not ice cold, but plenty cool and delicious. Just a simple technique that is being lost from one generation to the next if we don't seek it out or if we don't pass it along. She says, we had all the meat we wanted. As mentioned above, we had a variety of animals. We didn't have any way to freeze the meat, so my mother bottled a lot of it in the pressure cooker. She bottled beef, pork, lamb, chicken, and rabbit. And when Daddy killed a pig, he would cut out the portions for ham and bacon. Daddy always cured our bacon and ham, and it was quite a process. He made a rub with brown sugar, salt, and pepper, and I don't know what else, but he would rub and rub and rub and rub it into that meat, and then he would wrap the meat in clean flour sacks and hang them on the north side of the house up high under the eaves where the sun don't shine. Do any of you remember that? I've never even seen that done. Okay? After a couple of weeks, he'd get the meat down and go through the same process of rubbing and rubbing the mixture into the meat. He also had a large needle-looking thing that he would put some liquid rub inside the meat, and he would again hang the meat up under the eaves. A couple of weeks later, he would do it again. I don't remember how many times he would do that, but he would do it multiple times. All things considered, I had a pretty good life when I was growing up. We had to work hard, including the kids, but it was very satisfying, and the rewards were great. And she goes on to talk about building an ice house and cutting the ice out of the lake, and she says, I wish I had tried harder to learn some of the things that we had available to us in order to be better prepared in case of an emergency, although I have no doubt that if it were necessary, I would learn very quickly how to cope. So I share that with you basically to sum up what we've talked about here tonight, where we talk about being self-sufficient again. This knowledge, this amazing wisdom and knowledge that our parents and our grandparents have, we cannot let that slip away. We cannot lose that. If you research something online on the internet, if there's something out there like how to build an ice house, download it, print it into a hard copy. Don't think that you're always going to go to the internet and it's going to be there, because if there's an earthquake on the Wasatch Front and we lose the fiber optic cables, we'll have no internet. Okay? Get the information, print it, make hard copies, get books. Speak with your elders, speak with your grandparents, speak with your parents. How did you used to do this? How did you store your fruits and vegetables? How do you skin a chicken? How do you do that? You just don't go to the store and, buy a chicken and that's how it's done. Somewhere the chicken had to be skinned. You see what I mean? Learn how to do these things. Learn how to till the earth. Grow a garden, grow an orchard, raise farm animals, make bread, dig a root cellar. Learn how to can and bottle and purchase the necessary equipment to do so. Use a washboard, have a clothes line. How long has it been since we saw one of those? Sharpen a knife, cook food using fire, and I put a note here, learn how to cook food at all. Mend clothing, sew. I know how to sew on a button. I'm very proud of that. That's the extent of my knowledge when it comes to sewing. Fortunately, I have a wonderful wife who's knowledgeable about sewing, and so how many of us could darn our socks if we needed to? A few of us still know how to do that? Oh, so it's not me? Okay. So, just consider doing some of these simple things that we think are arduous or not worth our time. Learn how to do those things. Have the tools to do those things. It is critical that we be successful within our own families. We can retain the knowledge given to us by our ancestors of how to not just survive, but how to live and how to live well. Enjoy the gizmos and the gadgets. Take advantage of speed, convenience, and immense knowledge, but don't be caught unprepared if events beyond any government's ability to mitigate should find you unprepared. 2 final thoughts. Barbara Bush gave this at the Wellesley College commencement in 1990. She says, "Your success as a family and our success as a society depends not on what happens in the White House, but on what happens inside your house." Remember that this election season. And the last one, my wife's grandparents, who passed away a few years ago, they had a cross-stitch sign up on their wall, and it said this, and I'll leave you with this. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, and do without. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to speak with you tonight. Thank you so much, Brent, for the opportunity to come and address the community here in Vernal. And I hope that you've had as much fun tonight as I have. I hope that you've enjoyed the things that we've talked about. I also hope that you've been able to see how great this information is, how it relates to preparedness, because this is preparedness itself. This was common sense, and we've gone so far away that in order to make it through the future, I really do believe that we need to look back, maintain that information and keep it, and pass it on to the generations to come. So thank you very much. You've been great. Does anybody have any questions or any comments? Anything that they'd like to add or bring up? Yes. That was cool? Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to go home and tell my kids. He thought I was cool. Is there anything else? Yes. Thank you. Let me share something with you briefly as the Uintah County Emergency Manager. We write a lot of plans for the community. The emergency operations plan and the emergency support functions, the tactical interoperability communications plans, the mitigation plan, the continuity of operations plan, the recovery plan. And we write all these plans to help our communities. I want you to know personally, as the emergency manager, the best plan that we can have is the plan within our own home. Because, there's just me. If there's a 8.0 earthquake in Vernal or a F4 tornado, I can't do it all by myself. And we're going to call on people to come and help. But the best thing we can do for our citizenry here in Vernal, here in the Uintah Basin, is for people to be able to self-sustain for an extended period of time. And I tell people up to 30 days. If you've got enough food for one meal, that's great. At least that's one meal that you're not going to come to me to ask me for, because you're going to have taken care of that. But what if you had 2 meals? What if you had 10 meals? What if you had enough wood for your fireplace for the next 12 nights? What if you had enough fuel, like propane and charcoal briquettes, to get by for 30 days? The more self-sustaining we are within our own homes, the better off we are as a community and the more resilient we will be. So anyway, thanks again. Thank you very much.